visiting the Muslim Institute YouTube channel. My name is Samir Rahman and I'm here with my colleague Nisha Monahan and Dr. Shannon Shah, who is lecturer in religion and social science at King's College London. In this video we'll explore the concept of critical thinking and why we at the Muslim Institute think it's an important aspect of what it means to be Muslim in today's interconnected and evolving world. Shannon, we're both deputy editors of Critical Muslim, which is the quarterly publication of the Muslim Institute. Do you think critical thinking is a very new concept, or is it something that has a tradition and a history that we're continuing?
I think, well, first of all, critical thinking to me is about questioning inherited assumptions and testing them with the available evidence. And I think if we look at the early sources of Islam, it's always been there. One of my favorite hadith or traditions from the Prophet was when he is walking through a date orchard and he looks at this improbable way that these date trees have been tied to each other and asks his followers what's going on, and they say, well, this is how we fertilize dates. And he says, well, I don't think that's going to work. And so his followers then tell each other, Muhammad says it's not going to work, we have to stop this. The next year there is no harvest of dates. And Muhammad, peace be upon him, says to his followers, why don't we have any dates this year? And they said, well, because we didn't do what we usually do with the date palms. And the Prophet said, well, why didn't you do that? And they said, well, you said it wouldn't work. And he said, I'm not a date farmer, I'm a prophet. You're the date, I just said it looks strange to me. So I think there's this humor in our tradition, and there's a demonstration of, well, there are experts who know what they're doing because they've done it with the evidence available, they've tested it, and it's okay to question. So I think there are different ways to read this hadith, but I think one way to read it is that it is about critical thinking.
And I think it's really important to understand that really the concept of critical thinking and the practice of critical thinking was encouraged by the Prophet, by the first followers of Islam. I mean, for example, you had the idea of kind of interrogating and questioning sort of ideas, and then forming a kind of consensus, an opinion, and this was done in shura committees, and this was a very kind of democratic and very kind of like harmonious way of establishing practical solutions to contemporary issues. And it was something that continued from the time of the Prophet and continued after the time of the Prophet too.
I think one of the best examples of that, and I agree, is the second caliph, Umar al-Khattab, when he suspended the punishment of chopping off of hands for thieves, which is mandated in the Quran. But this was because of the widespread poverty in the Muslim polity at that point, which made people say, well, are you going against the Quran? And he said, well, I'm not going against it, but I have to respond to the imperatives of justice. And again, this was Umar applying critical thinking, and it was to the source of what we think of as the inspiration of Islam, the Quran itself. So yeah, I agree.
And really, I mean, critical thinking is a cornerstone of what the Muslim Institute does. I mean, it's very much sort of, what we're trying to sort of promote and encourage.
Exactly. I mean, through working in the Muslim Institute and with Critical Muslim, we're trying to create this platform and safe space for people to have these discussions, for people to actually engage in these topics that we know that are already occurring. We do it at our annual Ibn Rushd lectures and winter gatherings, as well as other regular events that we host. So we have quarterly journal releases for Critical Muslim, as well as Critical Muslim conversations in other ways, and seminars and socials. So we've got this going on sort of throughout the blood of the Muslim Institute.
Because we all know that people are questioning, and people, I think a lot of us have been brought up to maybe believe in this idea of kind of not questioning what we've been told to believe in. So there's this reverence that's kind of attached to religion, but I think it's important to understand that the reverence is not necessary. I mean, it's important to be respectful, but you don't need to defer to gatekeepers who will tell you this is what Islam believes and this is what we should think in Islam. I think it's important to interrogate assumptions and
Absolutely.
interrogate the concept of truth. And this is what the Muslim Institute tries to do. It provides a space in which people can have challenging discussions and dissect some of the kind of some of the beliefs and understanding that we have, and really consider how they can be appropriate for sort of 21st century, like life in Britain or in the US or in Egypt or in Pakistan. So for example, the Imams of the Sunni and Shia mazhabs, they were all emphatic that if any new evidence was to arise or to sort of come to the fore, that was to contradict their pronouncements, they would amend and adjust, their fatwas, and this would be accepted. So this idea of Islam as kind of constantly evolving and not being dogmatic or static was always it was always intrinsic to the practice of Islam from the time of the Prophet.
And I think it's okay as Muslims to admit that it wasn't always pretty. As Sunni Muslims, we know that we've had caliphs who were assassinated because of differences of opinion and sectarianism. We know that the Quran, as the Muslim territory spread, there were variant readings which caused a lot of panic and dissension amongst authorities and lay Muslims, and these were not always resolved as well as they could have been resolved. But I don't think it harms us as Muslims to admit that.
Absolutely. I think truly engaging with Islam does mean, thinking critically about what we're saying, questioning what we believe, and really engaging with the religion as a whole. And that's what we're trying to do here, and also as the Muslim Institute as a whole. And if you are in a situation where you feel like you want to question something, or you want to be in an environment where you won't be shut down when you're speaking about these topics, then please do become a fellow of the Muslim Institute. We are a safe space. We are a very diverse group of people who like to talk about all of these different topics.
And I think what we try to do is challenge this idea that critical thinking is in some way un-Islamic or something negative. I think it's about kind of being introspective and owning your issues, and it can be done in a way that it can be framed in a way that's sort of empowering. So, for example, I think if you're framing interrogative arguments, if you're talking about hijabi women who wear hijab, or or the niqab, or if you're talking about those kind of issues, you elevate the voices
Absolutely.
of Muslim women. Similarly, if you're talking about anti-blackness, you elevate the voices of black Muslims. I think it's about sort of critical thinking is really, it can be a very powerful and empowering kind of movement.
I agree, and I think speaking personally, when I first joined as a fellow in 2012, what I loved about the Muslim Institute was that there were no blocks or boundaries to the questions I could ask, but I knew that all of us in the Institute were being critical because of our love of Islam, because of our love of our tradition, our faith as Muslims. Because I think the fear is there are different reasons why people might be critical about something. You might be critical because you want to poke holes at something, or you want to undermine it. But you can also be critical because you really love something and you just want to see it improve. And you want to make sure that it remains relevant in your life and the lives of the people that matter to you. And I think that's what I found in the Muslim Institute.
Critical thinking, it really sort of generates vibrancy of thought and vibrancy of ideas. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is the concept of innovation is considered, in very negative terms in Islam, but actually innovation is about generating ideas and about sort of finding new paths through which you can kind of navigate and negotiate sort of issues and problems that arise. So I think by celebrating critical thinking and challenging dogma, really, we're encouraging, we're showcasing vibrancy, and that's a positive thing.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a question of power involved here, because the kind of innovation that has been shunned upon has been the kind of innovation that's not sanctioned by whoever was in political power. But then the question incumbent upon us as Muslims is, well, under what conditions do we get to question people in power?
Exactly.
Right? So,
And who holds the structures of power? So, for example, we've talked a little bit in the past about sort of, does critical thinking exacerbate Islamophobia? But again, it goes back to what I said earlier about sort of how do we frame the interrogative arguments? Who gets to make the criticisms? Is it a criticism that's being imposed upon Muslims, or is it
internal?
Is it internal? Is it an internal narrative that's being expressed?
Exactly.
and I think the Islamic studies scholar Omid Safi from Duke said something that has stuck with me to this day, where he says, we need to develop the skills of multiple critique as well. Because just because you critique some things within current or past Muslim practices, it doesn't mean you lose sight of the fact that there is something called Islamophobia out there. And sometimes the two criticisms can be connected, how they feed off each other. And I think what the Muslim Institute, again, is for me, is a space where we all get to practice having different thoughts in our brain. I feel like it's about helping me develop a bigger brain.
Yeah, it's about sort of intellectualizing kind of our practice of faith without losing the sacred. Muslim communities aren't sort of
homogenous, they're not a monolith. That's what we really need to start thinking about as well. There's so much disparity in thought, and to think about that in an intellectual way internally is what we need to start doing more of. And I think we do at the Muslim Institute a lot, and in every capacity that we can. I think the other thing to consider as well is that many people within Muslim communities are hesitant to think critically about Islam as a whole, or the way it's practiced, or any sort of facet of that, because there's so much external criticism. And if it's so much part of the rhetoric about Islam already, as Muslims, there's a potential for not wanting to contribute to that negative rhetoric.
And it's true. I mean, there is a lot of Islamophobia, there is a lot of kind of scrutinizing of Muslims. We do feel under the spotlight. But I think this is why it's so important to understand how critical thinking is framed, within which power structures are these arguments kind of framed, and through which lens do we sort of perceive them and sort of view them.
And I think it goes back to that old joke, isn't it? Like, I can say what I want about my mother, you can she's not your mother. And I think there's a bit of that going on as well. And I understand that. But I understand that. I empathize with that. I feel it very strongly. But at some point, we have to go beyond that as well. Because I think, from my perspective, if we love something enough, the criticisms we have of it would always set ourselves apart from the criticisms of the people who hate it. And I think that will become clear. I'm kind of confident that the wider public that doesn't have a position maybe on these things, I am sure that they'll be able to differentiate the intents and motivations the more that they engage with the arguments, which is why it's more important for people like us to get our voices out there as well.
Definitely.
And I think with introspection and with by being self-critical, I think that leads to growth, and I think that leads to an energy and a sort of a maturity, a way of kind of navigating our path through the world, through this kind of complex and rapidly changing world. And I think that's what Critical Muslim, the quarterly that the Muslim Institute publishes with Hurst, is that's what it does. It kind of like looks at issues in depth and uses analysis and critical thinking to really sort of forensically kind of dissect issues in a way that I think is quite innovative and original.
Definitely. Okay guys, so to tie up, I want you to tell me who your favourite critical thinker is. I think right now mine is David Olusoga. Samia, who's yours?
Well, I mean, obviously, my instinct, my first kind of response is Ziauddin Sadar, who's one of the of the Muslim.
No one told her to say that.
But, I mean, he's the foremost kind of critical thinker within sort of like Muslim communities.
Is,
but I also have a real soft spot for bell hooks. because I think she has really been emancipatory in our thinking of intersectionality, of kind of identity politics,
Definitely.
of gender issues, as well as race and faith as well. I think we can apply a lot of her teachings to how we understand sort of kind of what constitutes kind of identity.
I agree on, I am feeling very bad because I kind of brought up this question and now I don't know the answer to it. But I think probably because I have so many, and some of them are people both of you have mentioned already. Love Bell Hooks, love David Olsokov. But I think for me, a book that really influenced me was You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train by Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of America, and so on. And he was, this was a white man from New York who became an academic, comes from a working class background, but really immersed himself in the issues of his time and really saw through the power structures at work in the United States, whether it was getting involved in the civil rights movement, because I think he taught at a black university at some point in his career and was right there in the middle of the civil rights movement, and also his criticisms of American foreign policy, and given where he's come from, the fact that he could develop that by engaging with life around him and also using his knowledge and research as an academic, I think he's a real inspiration to me.
And I think the other important thing to mention is as well, in terms of critical thinkers, is how many of our favourite critical thinkers have been involved in Muslim Institute and critical Muslim events.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, for example, we have the annual Ibn Rushd lecture, which takes place every year. We've had really phenomenal, groundbreaking speakers. Amira Benison delivered the first talk on Ibn Rushd, a man of our time, for our time. We've had Oliver Leaman, Lord Bhikkhu Parekh talked about multiculturalism in an age of Trump and Brexit. We've also had Ibrahim Musa from the US.
The novelist Muhammad Hanif.
The novelist Muhammad Hanif was talking about sort of freedom of expression in Pakistan. Talking about freedom of expression, we organised a conference called The Cultures of Intolerance, and that was really in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which occurred in 2015, I think it was, November. I remember it was November 2015. There was another spring conference that where Shannon and I first worked together.
This was Diversity, the Gift of Islam, which we co-organised with Iman, the LGBT Muslim group in London.
And that really was very powerful.
I mean, it covered a lot of things. It covered what do we mean by fiqh and Sharia, conversion,
interfaith,
migrants and refugees, interfaith, gender, same-sex marriage, but we weren't afraid to go there, and I think not everyone agreed on everything. We invited speakers who had very different points of view about many different issues, and that was what was great about it.
Because really it was sort of celebrating plurality of thought, and that is what critical thinking is. It's recognising that we're not a homogeneous mass as Muslims, and that we have many different positions, and debate and discussion is always constructive as long as it's respectful. So on that note, I think that's all we've got time for, isn't it? So many thanks to Misha Monahan.
You're welcome.
And to Dr. Shannon Shah.
My pleasure.
And thank you from myself.
Thank you, Samia.
Thank you, Samia, absolutely. So thank you for coming and watching Sofa Chats with the Muslim Institute. Make sure you press that subscribe button up there and click the little bell icon as well to make sure you get notifications every time we post. It's going to be a fantastic series. We really loved having Shannon here, and we'll see you next time. Bye.